Hello, everyone. Welcome to Conatus Views. This is the 4th episode, and I'm here with Scott.
It's great to be back.
And we have a special anonymous guest here to talk about the Syrian airstrikes and Syria in general.
Hello, it's nice to be with both of you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on here.
For people like outside of Syria who may not know all that much about Assad and his regime, apart from maybe this recent incident and some other things in the past, can you talk a little bit about sort of the Assad regime, some of the sort of the atrocities that they've committed over time, and just give us like a little bit more of like a background on that, and perhaps some experiences that you might know about that might not be well known to sort of like Westerners who may not know about these sort of things.
Absolutely. I think to understand the reign of the Bashar regime, we have to understand his father, who took control of over the country, and Bashar inherited Syria. So basically, he was a dictator who had a really strong intelligence agency. I believe in 2015 there were almost 13,000 political prisoners who were hung. In 1982. There was almost a sign of a civil uprising in a city called Hama, and in a month the regime had executed 10,000 people in less than a month. And just living there personally, I mean, I'm so scared to talk about the regime that I have to remain anonymous because I'm aware of the consequences of speaking out. There is no freedom of speech or freedom of thought. There is, for years we had to live in this enclosure. And what happened during the revolution was a huge sign of bravery. These people, they came together and consolidated for freedom, for liberty, for their right for autonomy. And this is, I think, something that the West needs to understand, that in the midst of all of this chaos, in the midst of all of this narrative, were people who were fighting for their freedom and their right to live peacefully and their right to live the way they want to, without having this brutality, this violence inflicted on them.
Yeah, there's some very good points that you raise, and some absolutely horrifying statistics as well.
So this news has hit us in the past few days. It's been a bit of a surprise. So it was announced that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons. This is not exactly the first time that this has happened, right? But this time, the US government has decided to launch an airstrike, and the British and French governments have decided to cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
So this is quite difficult, for me at least. I'm seeing a lot of confusion around these issues. And so I think it's really important to talk to someone who is connected to Syria in some way to get their take on it, which is why I'm really glad we have you on here. Because I've seen people say, well, if you don't support these airstrikes, then you don't care about Syrian people, because it's Syrian people who are going to suffer from these gas attacks. And then I've seen people say, well, if you support these airstrikes, then you don't care about the Syrian people. So it's I really want to figure out what is best for people in Syria. What is the best thing to ensure that they are as safe as possible. If you got the Syrian government launching gas attacks on one side and then airstrikes from Western governments on the other, what is the best option here? What should we, as people in the West, is there something which we should be challenging our governments on?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. I think it's, firstly, we need to realize that we're not restricted to an either or narrative or dichotomy. So we can always have choices. It doesn't have to be either the airstrikes or we have to be against all oppressive forces, whether it was imperialist or dictatorship. And so this is where I stand personally. It's realizing the hardship that we had to endure during this civil war, and realizing that no, U.S. intervention or Western intervention is not going to solve anything. It's not taking care of the grassroots struggles of the people. And this is where the main focus lies. I think it's providing solidarity with the people and the values of the revolution.
Okay, so you've mentioned obviously the Syrian Revolution. We're obviously talking about the latest airstrikes that occurred on Friday on various military locations in and around Damascus in response to the chemical attacks. I believe it was just east of Damascus last week. But what might also be useful is to sort of go back a little bit, especially for some of our listeners who may not be well versed in the Syrian conflict, and because there's many more angles than just sort of obviously the Syrian government and versus the rebels. You've got sort of like the Kurds, you've got ISIS, you have sort of the Free Syrian Army, you have the Turks over in sort of like the north and the northwest. So can you briefly go through some of those like component parts of this ongoing Syrian civil war, which has been going on for, I believe, about 7 or 8 years now?
Yes, it's 7 years. It's honestly a little difficult for me to explain it because I feel I wouldn't do it justice. I'm not that well versed in it, but I can say that, yeah, what started with the People's Revolution has diverged into many segments. Some of them have, some of the soldiers that were in the army created their own Free Syrian Army, but they are now supported with Turkey, who are against the Kurds. Yeah, and I believe there was just this elaborate segmentation of the people, of the agents in Syria.
Yeah, it's certainly a complicated conflict, and that's something quite important that I think you brought up, Scott, in combination with what you were saying, Guest, is with the issue of imperialism. Of course, I totally agree with you, but it's I mean, it's not just Western imperialism. There's Russian imperialism and Turkish imperialism as well, and everyone's got their own sort of interests in the region. So it must be particularly awful for people in Syria to have all of these powers sort of fighting over them, and sometimes helping, sometimes hindering. It's very complicated for someone who is not directly connected to the conflict to try and figure out what's going on. Who can we even believe? And then we've got this bring it back to this airstrike. I mean, Donald Trump has got all these problems back in America. It really seems like the investigation into his collusion with Russia and potentially all kinds of other dodgy dealings, that's really coming to a close now. So, I mean, you have to wonder how much this airstrike is a distraction from his sort of domestic troubles. And then, the British and French governments just going along with this. I supported the government's analysis of this poison attack, which happened on our own soil, because it seemed like most of the international community agreed with the analysis of our government. But in this case, it's the US government going in with France and Britain. It doesn't seem to be exactly an international consensus.
Yeah, I want to pinpoint two things. This is not the first time the U.S. launched an airstrike on Syria. Actually, it's been doing so repetitively for the past year, and especially in 2017. I think this is the first time, like you said, it's doing it in allegiance with Britain and France. And also I want to talk about the saturation of truth in online media, which makes it so hard for it's so difficult for people even in the country itself to understand what's happening, because you have this conflicting narratives and you have this propaganda and disinformation campaigns that are really making it hard for people to obtain facts about the situation. Which is why I think now you find an increase in support towards the regime, an increase in support towards Russia. And when it comes to the airstrike, I think we need to ask ourselves, how effective is this going to be? You know, okay, so let's say you launched an airstrike, you started a war, okay, and then what is the end goal here? I don't think there's an end goal in sight, and if there is one, it's not going to be a peaceful one, that's for sure. And the people who are going to end up getting hurt are just the Syrian people who already have been hurting for the past 7 years.
Yeah, excellent points. Especially when you take into account that Donald Trump tweeted out that they were going to launch these airstrikes before they happened, something which he had previously criticized President Obama for. We've heard reports that the Russians sort of assisted the Syrian government in evacuating these facilities and so on before the airstrikes hit. So
yes, yeah, I think the States is now finding itself in a situation of the boy who cried wolf. You know, they've done this narrative so many times before in many different countries that now when something happens, it's like nobody believes them, and they, with rightfully so. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's what I was finding with again this poisoning case, is the comments online, people saying, well, you know, the government lied about Iraq, so why should we trust anything they say about intelligence ever again? And you know, you can understand that point of view. I didn't agree with that in that case, because again, I think the whole of Europe running around the UK seems to suggest that there was something there, but yeah, I mean, as you rightly pointed out, there's this sort of this saturation of narratives and a breakdown in trust between people and governments, and yeah, it's tricky for me because, as I say, I totally understand why people would be skeptical of governments. I feel like, I've said it multiple times in this series, I feel like the establishment has been far too complacent, assuming that people would just go along with, you know, sort of whatever the government wants to, you know, whatever they want to do. And on the other hand, I do worry about the possible alternatives, you know, with, as you say, with Russia coming in, but not just Russia. You know, we have you know, far right in our own countries are threats in and of themselves, and you know, so this is why I'm skeptical of people who are pro-populist, if you like, because while there's certainly a lot wrong with the establishment, in my view, the question is, you know, what comes afterwards. I've seen some people take a sort of a blanket anti-establishment position. You have to wonder, well, you know, it's not just about what we tear down. It's a question of what gets built up again afterwards. At least that's the way I see it.
Yeah, no, just to feed off of what you were saying about the trust issue. Yes, there's a barometer actually, and it found that people have lost trust, 37 points, a decrease in trust in the U.S. government this year and the previous year. But like you said, I think it's seeing what the end goal is. And I think if we're going to be critical about this, we need to also be critical about the Assad regime itself, to understand its history, understand its oppressive reign, and to see this kind of contagious support through right-wing parties and authoritarian regimes towards Bashar al-Assad.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I have to say, some left-wing groups in the UK as well supporting Assad.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's mostly sort of, the tankies, as they call them, the Stalinists. But even big organizations like Stop the War have basically refused to support, people like Peter Tatchell, who's been campaigning for against the Syrian government. And I feel like this is a real split in the Western left at the moment. People taking various sides, and I mean, it doesn't seem to have made a huge dent for now, but it does sort of symbolize to me the degeneracy, if you like, of the Western left, that they are so split on this. I mean, you have these people supposedly on the far left joining hands with the far right to support a totally brutal regime. I mean, I never want to hear a Western leftist saying anything about legitimate governments ever again, right? I've said before about nationalism, and I think this sort of infusion of nationalism into the left that's sort of come from Lenin, Stalin, Mao. I think this is really, polluted the discourse, if you like, and that's the way I see it. That we have these people supporting purely nationalist movements, nationalist governments, on the grounds that they are opposing imperialism. And while imperialism is pretty awful, and we have, as I say, imperialism not just from the West but from various actors in the region, although they maybe want to be imperialists rather than actual global imperialists. I think the left has just been so fragmented. I think internationalism, or not just internationalism, but beyond internationalism, something we've discussed on this podcast before, universalism is the term I'd use. I think globalism has been too sullied by conspiracy theorists and so on. The question is, what's best for people everywhere. I think this is sort of something that's missing. People, groups, are looking at it too much in terms of strategy and forgetting the actual real human lives that are involved. As you say, humans. We shouldn't support the Syrian Revolution because that's what the West wants. The West wants to topple Assad, so we should do whatever the West doesn't want.
Yes.
And that is having disregard for people's lives, right? That is viewing people as means to an end. This is something that I've criticized before, where when you believe that the primary goal of your sort of your movement is to challenge your own government. So I mean, obviously everyone should challenge their own governments, but if your only goal is to topple your government, what that means is you want to support any force which opposes your government, which means that if anyone else is doing the same thing in another country, except well, you see where I'm going with this. There's no way to coordinate internationally, because in a way these groups are looking out for their own self-interest, which just happens to be tackling their own governments. So when people in the Western left focus exclusively on challenging Western imperialism, in my view, they're not focused on what's actually best for people in the countries which are affected by Western imperialism. I
completely agree.
I'm keen to get your thoughts on. There's this sort of strain of thought among certain elements of the not only I guess what you might call the far right, but also in some leftist circles I'm finding as well, they'll try and sort of defend or justify the Assad regime on the basis of, he's a secular ruler. He's, you know, he might be sort of harsh, but he's sort of like a necessary evil and that sort of thing. And they try to sort of almost gloss aside over those sort of human rights abuses and that sort of thing. So I'm just kind of keen to get your take on that sort of thinking that seems to have kind of emerged within some parts of that sort of like Western thinking on this issue.
Yeah, I don't understand this narrative that forces you to choose between the lesser of two evils. You know, like, yeah, he did some human rights abuses, but he was secular. No, we have to keep fighting for the value of human rights, and which clearly he does not stand for. So no, you always have options. And it wasn't completely secular. And there was this other narrative that, yeah, Bashar is fighting terrorists and that's why we should support him. No, we have to oppose all of oppressive agents.
And this is the thing, like with ISIS, which I mean, ISIS must be probably one of the most sort of evil organizations, evil regimes to have ever existed. Like, yeah, sure, in comparison, that might make Assad look less evil, but I mean, it's still going to be one of the worst regimes around, right?
Honestly, I don't know how can we compare evil, because they're both murderers. I mean, they're both radicals. They're both, to me, there are no difference. To me, they're just two terrorists, really.
Sure, yeah.
Right.
I've seen some people suggest that the Assad regime had deliberately released Islamists from their prisons in order to basically discredit the opposition, to make them look like Islamists to get support from the West. I don't know how true that is. I mean, certainly these groups were already in existence in Iraq as part of the fallout from the Iraq War. But I wonder if you have any comments or any knowledge about that.
I can't say I do. But yeah, no, I know there has been a lot of sabotage and there has been a lot of manipulation from many sides.
So in terms of the best possible outcome that could emerge from this this whole horrible mess, what do you see that as? I mean, what do you see as the best possible way forward which could happen?
I think it's recognizing what you mentioned earlier, this solidarity that goes beyond nationality, beyond nationality, beyond religion, beyond sex, beyond all of those constructs, and yeah, realizing the value of human life, and working towards that goal. I think working towards the deconstruction of oppressive systems, regardless of where they are.
Yeah, well said.
But I think that this is very important, to be aware of the injustices that are happening and to care. I feel there has been a lack of Western interest in the Syrian war and the Syrian uprising, because it's not personally affecting them. But thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on here. You seem to have taken some risk in doing so, and for that, we're eternally grateful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for your time today. It's been a really good insight into the whole mess in Syria, and to hear from someone that has sort of first-hand experience from it is been very valuable. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you guys.
So I'll say to our audience, hope you enjoyed today's episode. Do leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more. And if you have any comments on what you've heard today, do leave those under the video. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us. And hopefully we will see you all again next week.